Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Day Ahead Market Enhancements Configurable Parameters Implementation Working Group. My name is Cristina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'm joined by Guillermo Bautista Alderete, Jenny Araj, Haifeng Liu, and Oswin Thomas, who are at the ISO in a conference room, as well as Isabella Mahane and Scott Lemon, who are joining me online. Just a few friendly reminders before we get started today. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And this meeting is intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So please keep your comments professional and respectful today. Also, please try to keep your comments and questions succinct so that we're able to hear from everyone. And we welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation today. For raising your hand during the meeting, the raise hand icon is directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And there's also an Inteller transparency viewer that will have loaded up shortly. It's going to be at the bottom right of your screen, and you'll be able to see other attendees on the call, so be sure to refresh it prior to viewing. And closed captioning is also available by clicking the CC button on the bottom left of your screen. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And you can also send your comments and questions via chat to all panelists. And if you need any technical assistance today during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Inteller Events. Today we'll begin by hearing about the working group schedule and today's meeting objectives from Isabella Mahane. Then Isabella will review a summary of comments from the November working group. And then Guillermo Bautista Alderete will discuss an executive summary of findings before he leads a discussion on analysis number 3, set of enforced constraints results. And then Jenny Araj and Oswin Thomas will discuss updates to benchmark setup and associated market results. Then Scott Lemon will discuss sensitivity analysis number 4, proportion of deployed reserves results. And finally, Isabella will discuss next steps before we wrap up for the day. So with that, I'll turn things over to Isabella Mahane to get us started.
Thanks very much, Christina. And welcome everyone to today's working group. So I'm Isabella Mahane, account manager here at the ISO, as well as the facilitator for the implementation working group. So as Christina mentioned, we will kick off today's session with an overview of the schedule and the objectives for today's meeting. And then we'll move into a summary of the stakeholder feedback we received on our last working group session, which was on November 20th. And then we'll turn it over to the market analysis team to hear analysis results for the set of enforced constraints, as well as some updates to the benchmark setup and associated results. And then the sensitivity analysis for the proportion of deployed reserves. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of the ISO's overall stakeholder process. You'll see here that we are currently in the implementation stage of the process here with the implementation working group. Next slide. Okay, so this is a slide that many of you have probably seen a couple of times at this point, but for those who may be new to the working group and just joining us, we just want to provide a reminder of what an implementation working group is and what it is not. Especially given it is kind of a new forum that we've created for this effort. So it is an optional step in the project implementation process to really gain our participants' feedback on specific issues. So that feedback could range from feedback on business process options for interaction with the ISO, as well as technical information before those final decisions are made. Feedback on the parameters used in calculations, and then other options that align with the approved policy implementation. A couple reminders of what it is not. So it's not the forum to debate approved policies or tariff language. It's also, not a forum to discuss issues related to market simulation or parallel operations setup. While we realize that the analysis is based off of data available in those two areas, they are separate efforts. And it's also not a forum to discuss issues related to data quality and market sim or parallel operations as well. And then also we do have other forums that focus on releases, as well as a technical user group, and a settlements user group, and so those are separate forms outside of this as well. Next slide, sorry. All right, so again, I noted this on the last slide, but just although that this working group is occurring concurrent to Market Sim and parallel ops, it is its own independent effort. So those market simulation and parallel operations efforts are not dependent on outcomes from this working group, although this working group does leverage the Market Sim and parallel ops efforts to set up the scenarios for analysis and tuning of the parameters. And you'll see here on this snapshot of the configurable parameters tuning timeline that we're here at the December working group wrapping up the basic analysis and map stage before moving into some of the fine-tuning discussions that'll coincide with parallel operations. So we expect those discussions to start early next year. Okay, next slide. All right, so our engagement objectives for the working group is to review and assess the results of analysis scenarios, as well as provide feedback and observations of the scenario results from the analysis of each of the 5 configurable parameters, and then lastly, make recommendations on any parameter changes and refinements that may be needed based on those data-driven results from the analysis. All right, so I'll pause there and see if there are any questions before moving into a summary of some of the feedback we received from the last working group.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this moment, Isabella.
Okay. Then we can actually jump ahead, let's see, 2 or 3 slides to slide 13. All right. So some feedback we received from last session, really kind of more requests, was that to use different IR bid stacks and regionally diverse scenarios, as well as provide some additional metrics on the impact to AS awards and prices, and also really focus on the IR deployment factor instead of enforced constraints. So this is all feedback we've taken, and we will expand on in today's presentation. So you'll see some more information related to these 3 items later today. Next slide. We also received a request that the ISO provide additional sensitivity studies under a range of conditions. So this is something that we've really tried to include in the working group so far by augmenting some of the augmenting the benchmark cases in a number of ways to show a range of conditions. So through the working group, we have done multiple iterations of analysis on each of the parameters presented so far. And so we continue to kind of address this through the working group process. Some items that we will definitely be taking back for further consideration in upcoming working group sessions is a plan for evaluating the parameters in parallel operations. This is something that we are targeting to discuss in the January working group, as well as just continuing to take caution when interpreting results that use non-production quality data. This is something that we are aware of and continue to take into consideration. Okay, next slide. So some items that we will be monitoring after go live is assessing the impact of the envelope multiplier on real-time performance of storage resources that receive IR awards, as well as assessing the implications for the real-time market and actual operation of the system. Much of the assessment of the cost of imbalance reserves as the market actually receives that bidding information and there are financially binding prices that result will also be done after go live. And I know during our last working group, there was a question of kind of what's the plan in case changes are needed or in case changes are needed expeditiously, I should say, based on the analysis results. And we do have the BPM process available to us for those parameters that or changes that wouldn't require tariff revisions. So we could explore BPM changes, which are of course faster than tariff revisions for those that we are able to do that for. So that is an option. Okay, next slide. And then finally, there were some comments that we received for the October session that were submitted after the comment deadline, so we weren't able to include those in our summary during our last working group meeting, but we have included responses to those comments in the summary of comments we received on the November 20th session. So we did post a comment matrix, again, before this meeting to respond to those comments we received in the November session, and those late comments were addressed in that most recent matrix. So I wanted to flag that all for you. That's available out on the Day-Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative webpage. All right, so with that, I'll turn things over to Jenny. I think she has some updates on ancillary services, so I'll hand it to you.
Thank you. So one of the asks from the prior working group was for us to look at how the envelope constraint multiplier impacted AS pricing. And so I'll just remind everybody that the envelope constraint multiplier is the item that manages SOC throughout the day for storage resources, including energy and the new imbalance reserve product. Obviously one of our configurable parameters here. And so we did present an analysis showing the different envelope constraint multipliers from a low factor of 10% all the way up to the full, considering 100%. And so we had some interesting results here. Like we said, a modest impact, particularly this reg up pricing. In Hourly 19 we focused on, it's actually the 10%, so the low envelope multiplier that resulted in a high reg up price. And we see that because once you have the low envelope multiplier, you're going to go grab all your storage to meet your imbalance reserve requirements, and then that leaves less of the storage, which does often provide a lot of our regulation. It leaves less of the storage available for that regulation, and so we do see that kind of inverse relationship there with the price and the attenuation factor. But the other ancillary services seem to, again, like have a modest impact. There, the reg down seems to be all under $10. And if we go to the next slide, spin and non-spin, very low impact with all those, that six or seven different sets of envelope multipliers. We don't see much of an impact to spin and non-spin prices. Okay, if there's no questions, I can pass it to Guillermo for.
Yeah, it looks like we have one hand raised. Can we unmute Chenyu?
Yeah. Good afternoon. This is Chenyu from PG&E. Can you go back to the last two slides? And I think my question is, what envelope constraint that did you apply on the graph as a result here? Is it 10% or 40% or 25%? Or is this
so
just, yeah.
There's 7 different scenarios there, and so you go from the very light blue is 10% all the way to the black is 100%. So 7 different scenarios, and then the pricing impact.
Ah, I see. Okay. And can you go back to one more slide to the 17?
Yeah.
All right. It's good to understand how to read this. Thank you.
Yes.
So next slide, Christina. So for this working group, again, we'll focus on analysis results for the set of enforced constraints, as well as updates to the benchmark setup, and analysis results for the proportion of deployed reserves. So if we go to the next slide, we'll just see kind of a visual representation of the focus for today's working group, again, on the set of enforced constraints and proportion of deployed reserves. And then if we move to the next slide, here's a visual representation of our focus for the January working group. So we'll shift focus at that time to the default bid price for imbalance reserves, as well as discuss a plan for parallel operations. All right, so at this point, I'll turn things over to Guillermo, and he'll review the executive summary of analysis findings with us.
Thank you, Isabella. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your time towards the end of the year to participate and engage in the discussion for this working group session regarding the configurable parameters. We are in the third round, and we have moved into analyzing the dynamics of two specific parameters. One is actually, there is a misnomer for one of those because it's not a parameter. When we are deciding what set of constraints, transmission constraints, we are going to be enforcing for imbalance reserves, it's not about tuning one specific value, it's more about a selection criteria. And we are going to elaborate on that. The other parameter that we're going to be analyzing is regarding the deployable factor, and effectively is out of the award that we provide for imbalance reserves through the different resources, how much of that award we are going to take into account to assess against the feasibility of the transmission constraint. How much of that is going to consider to flow through the transmission constraint for congestion management. And that is the scope of today's working group. We have used a benchmark, as usual, for this setup of the analysis. That is our reference to assess how the different sensitivity cases can be assessed against this benchmark. The benchmark that we are using is effectively using the starting point of the deployable reserves, 100%. That means for every megawatt of awarded imbalance reserve that is in the market solution, we consider all that to be impacting the transmission constraints, obviously based on the shift factors of these resources, but we account for every megawatt awarded. And we also take as a reference the starting point for the envelope constraint multiplier, that is 85%. Now, what we are also assessing here for this session has to do with congestion. A different setup that we have for this benchmark is the enforcement of different transmission constraints to the point that they are congested, they get binding, not only for energy, but also for imbalance reserves, because that is how we can really get the value to be able to understand the implications of these parameters. We need to have transmission constraints congested for imbalance reserves, either up or down. And what you're going to see is that through this benchmark, we're going to have, generally speaking, a case of high load conditions. We are using the case of the 44,000 megawatts of demand with high imbalance reserves, just to create a condition where we are in a better setup to trigger good dynamics of the market, given that we have to meet an elevated level of demand. Regarding the first topic, that is the set of enforced constraints, what you are going to see through the elaboration of this section down the deck is that we are expecting that we are going to enforce all the constraints for all transmission constraints for imbalance reserves that are, as of now, or under the EDAM, enforced for the energy product. Effectively, we want to remain consistent and using the same set of transmission constraints in the EDAM for energy and for imbalance reserves. And that covers the spectrum of what we call flow gates that are typically thermal limitations, transmission lines, transformers, branch groups, transmission corridors. But we also have security-based constraints that are defined in two groups: contingencies that typically are the N-1 contingencies, and nomograms that are more sophisticated security-based constraints. All these three constraints are typically the set of constraints that we have enforced in the energy market, day ahead, real time, and that we see congestion happening. And therefore, these are the primary suspects to have those enforced and potentially congested for imbalance reserves. One of the key elements in this assessment is going to be not about the quality of the solution, not about the profile of the imbalance reserves procured or the prices. It really boils down to one practical point, and that is, can we actually afford to enforce all these transmission constraints for imbalance reserves? Because effectively we're doubling the effort, the computational effort for the market application to find a solution by enforcing and managing constraints for energy and then the same set of constraints for imbalance reserves. Can we have enough computing capability to be able to achieve an optimal solution within the expected time of running the market? That, at the end, is going to be the limiting factor to determine if we can enforce all the set of constraints or we have to come with a subset that can be based on certain logic that we are going to explain. Next slide, please. Going into the second topic, we have the envelope constraint multiplier assessed in relative terms to the implications for ancillary service pricing. And that is the item that Jenny already covered. And we do see some inverse relationship that as we have lower envelope multipliers for imbalance reserves, that means we can leverage more on storage resources to carry imbalance reserve, and that naturally can take a space for providing other type of ancillary services, which naturally is going to put upward pressure on prices. So the consequence is that most likely we're going to see higher ancillary service prices when we have lower envelope constraint multipliers. When we go into the next parameter, that is the proportion of deployable reserves, what we are going to see, as you are going to appreciate through the illustrations and examples, is that imbalance reserves is procured nodally, and therefore there will be locational prices for different resources carrying imbalance reserves, and that price is going to be generally composed not only of the system or the balancing area price, but also by the congestion component that is coming from the transmission constraints that are binding for imbalance reserve up and down. And similar to energy, you are going to see that anytime there is a congestion related to imbalance reserves, that price is going to be reflected accordingly in the resource locational marginal price. What we are seeing is that as the congestion reflected by the shadow prices for energy and imbalance reserves materializes in different conditions, those shadow prices that measure the severity of the congestion are going to be predicated on the level of the imbalance reserve factor that we are using. As we change the parameter of the deployable factors, we expect that there will be a tighter or more liberal conditions to do the congestion management, and therefore the congestion prices are going to reflect that condition. Lastly, we have that the proportion of imbalance reserve, deployable imbalance reserves are going to be based on where the imbalance reserve is procured. We are talking about nodal procurement, and therefore location matters. Where the resource is located relative to the transmission constraint is going to highly determine what the award is going to be, but also the price that that resource is going to be exposed to, because there could be either a scenario in which the resource may exacerbate or mitigate the congestion, and therefore the marginal congestion component for imbalance reserve is going to be positive or negative. That is not at all different to what happens currently for energy. It's a mirror situation. In this case, we are dealing with imbalance reserves. And these are the main takeaways. The next sections are going to go more into the details to provide the context and the illustrations how we can come with these high-level messages. Before I pass to the team to go into the detailed analysis, let's pause, Isabella, and see if we have any comments or reactions to this summary.
seeing any hands. Christina, do you see any on your side?
No, I'm not seeing anything in the chat either.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Now let's move on to the first topic. And one of the 5 parameters that are defined in the scope of this working group session is called the set of enforced constraints. As I indicated, this is actually a misnomer for the classification of this item, because we are not talking here about setting a specific value, playing with that value in our range. It is indeed what we call a selection criteria. Now, let's step back and go back to the principle of the extended day-ahead market. We have an existing real-time product that is a flexible ramping product, which is procured nodally based on the transmission configuration, based on the enforced constraints. We can procure FRP, ensuring that they are going to be deliverable by being able to flow through the different transmission constraints of the system. It is the same principle that we are applying here for imbalance reserves in the context of the day-ahead market. We have procurement of imbalance reserves that are going to be assessed against the feasibility to flow through the transmission constraints, and that means as part of the optimization, as part of the optimal procurement of imbalance reserves, we have to ensure through the optimization that they are also deliverable, that they can flow if they are deployed through the different transmission constraints that we are enforcing. And that is predicated on some early findings that we have back in the real time, somewhere in 2016-17, when we realized that congestion was getting in the way to ensure that FRP could be deployed and be able to meet the uncertainty that is realized. And quite frequently, we found that even though we procure optimally the imbalance reserves, they happen to be stranded behind transmission constraints and therefore could not be deployed. That is addressed by having these deployment scenarios in which we take the bookend of the uncertainty. What if we assume that all the upward uncertainty is going to be realized and now we deploy all the imbalance reserves? That is one scenario that we check against all transmission constraints to ensure that all the energy plus all the realization of the imbalance reserves are going to be feasible to flow through the transmission constraints. And we do the same for the downward direction. If we assume that the downward direction is going to be realized, then we have to assess that the energy plus the associated imbalance reserve deployed for downward uncertainty are going to be feasible for the transmission constraints. And these are the 2 bookends of the uncertainty, and this is where we are assessing the deliverability of the imbalance reserves. A transmission constraint, as you are going to see through the different scenarios, is going to create very interesting scenarios here, because there may be conditions where you are going to see transmission constraints binding for energy only. In other cases, there could be constraints that are binding for energy, plus at the same time binding for imbalance reserve up, or even at the same time binding for imbalance reserve down. And there is an interesting price formation that we have to keep in mind of how all these play together for the final locational marginal prices. Next slide, please. When we are dealing with transmission constraints, either for energy, for FRP, or for imbalance reserves, we are talking about these physical or security-based constraints that are modeled through the market optimization, such that as part of the market clearing process, we are performing concurrently what we call the congestion management. There are effectively 3 types of transmission constraints that we currently enforce in the CAISO markets, and we're expecting to enforce in the extended day-ahead market. One group is the base flow gates. These are physical elements such as lines, transformers, branch groups, transmission corridors. It's a thermal limitation that tells you, based on temperature, based on the capability of the physical wire, the limit on that constraint is X megawatts. But we also have 2 other types of constraints. that are more related to security constraints. One of them is nomogram. That is a more complex relationship of different components of the transmission system to deal with specific security conditions. We may have many different operating procedures, and that requires certain combinations of transmission configuration and flows and loading on different elements that are defined only through this linear piecewise configuration that we call nomograms. In the end, it's a transmission constraint. And we also have contingency-based constraints. These are also related to physical elements, but is for a contingency. We typically refer to the N-1 state, ensuring that the limit can be maintained after we lose one element of the transmission system. And any of those can be modeled, can be congested, and therefore can limit the merit order dispatch of resources to meet either energy or the imbalance reserve requirements, and therefore are the primary suspect to assess for enforcement of the imbalance reserves. When we're dealing with congestion management for imbalance reserves, that is not at all different to what we are doing for congestion management for energy. We enforce the transmission constraints. We clear optimally different resources to meet the imbalance reserve requirements. That includes a price-responsive demand curve to realize the economic trade-off of how much we can clear economically for physical resources or just bypass the full requirement. The resources that are going to be procured in imbalance reserves are going to be assessed not only based on the economics of their participation, effectively the bids, but also where they are located. Location when dealing with nodal procurement is a key factor because in some cases, resources may be exacerbating congestion, and therefore they are going to be dispatched accordingly. The price signal is going to indicate that these resources should be decked for energy or should get procure less imbalance reserves to not exacerbate congestion. And on the other way, there could be resources that are going to provide counterflows. They are going to relieve and mitigate congestion. The price signal is going to indicate that these resources should be inked or procure more imbalance reserve because they help to manage the congestion constraints. And that brings us to the critical decision point. Given how critical is to the assessment of what constraints are going to be limiting the procurement of imbalance reserves, how we come with the determination of what transmission constraints are going to be enforced. Next slide, please. Before answering that question, I want to point back to some history that we have already in the assessment of this space. Not specifically for imbalance reserve, but for the corresponding case of flexible ramping product. We do have nodal procurement of FRP in the real-time market, which is assessed against transmission constraints. For some of you that may have the history of the FRP, you may recall that we went live with the nodal procurement back in February 2023. And that was the most significant change that we performed to the logic of the FRP procurement. And as we enforced an additional set of constraints to check against the congestion management for FRP, one direct consequence that we saw is that the computing time, the running time of the real-time market increased. Simply because you have a harder problem to solve, you have more constraints to assess, and in some cases may be proportional to the number of constraints that you are enforcing. By the time you increase transmission constraints to the market problem that has to be solved through the optimization, we are putting a harder problem to solve to the optimization. And naturally, that may lead to longer running times. relative to what we have done prior to implementing or enforcing these constraints. And there is a very sharp point in time here in this illustration. That is the go live of the FRP, the nodal FRP back in February 2023. The time before that is tracking the computing time of the real-time market, and that is in seconds. It's in the range of 400 seconds divided by 60 is like 6-7 minutes, and this is the 15-minute market indeed. And this is just the running time for the solution, for the optimization. And when we start enforcing additional constraints for FRP, we can see that it jumped typically from 400 seconds to about 450 seconds. It's like an extra minute of computing time. Later on, we enforced nomograms. That is a small, relatively speaking, a small set of constraints, transmission constraints, and we didn't see a very specific change in the computing time of the real-time market. That is how we started gradually bringing in constraints in the FRP for the real-time market. Next slide, please. What was missing, and as of now is still missing, is the enforcement of contingency-based constraints. We did some assessment in terms of the application running times when we enforced all set of contingencies for transmission constraints. And the shaded area here is effectively the period in which we enable and we keep activated the different set of transmission constraints that compose flow gates, nomograms, and contingencies. And what we see is that once we enforce contingencies, we appreciate a higher running time, going anywhere from 500 seconds to maybe 440 seconds. When you are dealing with the 5-minute market, every second counts because you are running the market every 5 minutes. So 30 seconds, that is a half minute, is a long time to afford, because that requires also time for the operators to actually review the solution and be able to feel comfortable with that solution and be able to push that set of dispatch targets. It became prohibited in terms of the computing time to enforce contingencies for the real-time market, specifically for the 5-minute market, and therefore we disabled the set of contingencies for FRP in the real-time market. As of now, I can tell you we continue to do assessments, and we may have found a way to enforce the contingencies for the 15-minute market. Potentially, that is as far as we can go for the real-time market, given how tight and fixed the time window is in the real-time market, that we are just unable to stretch that window because we have to run the market specifically at certain frequency on 5 and 15-minute basis. That is a little of the history that we have in dealing with enforcement of transmission constraints for FRP. That is a very good reference in relationship to what we are assessing now for the extended day-ahead market. Next slide, please. Let's go back now to the context of the extended day-ahead market. As of now, we don't have it. We only have the day-ahead market running for the California balancing area. And a good proxy in terms of the level of constraints that we may have eventually congested in the market could be taken from the real-time market. The information that is displayed here is a proxy of finding how frequently or how many constraints typically get congested in the real-time market for what will be the future EDAM footprint. That is basically the CAISO, PAC East, and PAC West balancing areas. Again, pegged to the historical performance of the real-time market. That implicitly assumes that we are expecting to see the same congestion that happens in the real-time to the day-ahead market, and obviously That may be a stretch, but it's still a good proxy to have an idea of the level, the extent of the constraints that may be congested in the extended day-ahead market. The trend here is organized in different groups. There is a group for CAISO balancing area constraints related to contingencies, the dark blue. The bright blue is the CAISO transmission constraints for flow gates. These are the thermal limitations, lines, transmission corridors, transformers. Then we have the gray area, that is the CAISO constraints for nomograms. And then at the top, there are, relatively speaking, the smaller sections. We have Pack East flow gates and Pack West flow gates, because these are the ones that have been historically congested and binding in the Western energy imbalance market. That is how the information is organized. Now let's turn the attention to the actual trend. What we see is that overall, about 52% of all the transmission constraints that are congested in the real-time market happen to be related to contingencies. Half of the congestion that we have in the system is driven by contingencies. About 33% are flow gates, and about 15% are nomograms. And it is a good reference to have in mind when we assess what set of constraints we're expecting to enforce in the market. You may see also a seasonal trend that typically we expect to see more congestion when the system is higher loaded. That happens to be in the summer because CAISO balancing area is a summer peaking system, and therefore you're going to have higher loading conditions on the transmission system that may lead to more frequent congestion. That is somehow expected. Things go down for non-summer months, and by the way, December, and we're still halfway in December, only accounts for the first half of the month, so it's not a complete month trend that you have in there. Let me pause before I go further. I see a one hand raised. Isabella, Cristina?
Am I unmuted?
Oh, yeah,
Alva,
you
can
are,
go ahead.
Alba.
Great, thank you. Alva Svoboda, PG&E. A couple of things I was curious about, just and you may not have observed these, but just does the set of contingencies that are used in the imbalance reserve deployment affect the degree to which market power mitigation is performed for that service? And then, and these are just questions I'm just curious, and then are there knock-on effects for market power mitigation for energy? And finally, if the two sets of constraints, day ahead and real time, are not consistent, does that imply anything about the arbitrage that would be evaluated by convergence bids in the market?
Yeah, great points, Alba. Let me answer those. I would put it in a more simpler way. You can ignore the labeling that we put to the transmission constraint, whether it's contingency, nomogram, or flow gate. At the end of the day, they are transmission constraints, and they are treated the same way for the optimization and for the market power mitigation process. All of them are assessed for competitiveness through the DCPA process. They go through the same math. There is really no distinction by the nature of the constraint. At the end, they are considered just another type of transmission constraint, but numerically, there is no difference in that sense. Now, I think I answered the first and the second question with that. Let me know if you have any follow-up before I jump to the third one.
Well, just did you observe, or have you yet observed any effects on actual degree to which there is market power mitigation, local market power mitigation in the runs when you have different sets of constraints? Is there a lot of mitigation when the full set of constraints is used compared to when a reduced set of constraints is used?
Yes, I would say for energy, we have the metrics. I don't recall from the top of my head what the statistics are between contingencies and flow gates, but I can tell you that they are assessed the same way. And indeed, that information is actually available on Oasis. I can bring those numbers next time, but
Great.
I don't have those in front of me.
Thanks. It'd be interesting to see whether that has an effect. And then on the third point, whether it has an effect on the virtual bidding charge.
Yeah, and now let me take care of the third question, because that is also a point that somehow in this section we are explicitly putting out there. One of the cornerstones of the assessment that we are doing is to ensure that we stay consistent and aligned across the markets. And that has been our mantra, not just for this effort that we are going through right now, but across the board for many different efforts that we have endeavored in the past. Because you are pointing to the key issue that misalignment can create, that is arbitrage, right? You have a different set of constraints enforcing the day ahead versus the real time. Now you are creating that difference that can be arbitrage, and it's going to be hard for the market to converge when it's an inherent misalignment of enforcement. That can happen not only because of the constraints that are enforced, but also by the megawatt values of the limits that are used between the markets. So to your point, one of the expectations that we have is that we can remain consistent between the set of constraints enforced in the real time for FRP and the day ahead for the imbalance reserves. That would be the ideal outcome that we aim at, to ensure that we mitigate for any misalignment between markets that can lead to arbitrage opportunities.
Right. Okay. So that's one of your design principles, basically, here.
Yes.
Thank you.
And it is somewhere in one of the slides of this section. I just don't remember where. Maybe it's coming next.
Appreciate your answers, Guillermo. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have two more hands in the queue, so let's go to Jordan Miner.
The CPUC Energy Division. So just to recap the last couple of slides, it sounds like we have computational limitations on what constraints can be enforced or not, because enforcing them will add too much time to the 5-minute market. So my question is, if we don't enforce constraints, will it result in us procuring undeliverable imbalance reserves?
Yes, that is the trade-off, right? The less constraints you enforce for imbalance reserves, the more risk you are opening to be undeliverable, because once you have uncertainty realized and that imbalance reserve has to be converted to energy, effectively it may not be able to flow because it was not assessed against a congested transmission constraint. That is the trade-off. Now, there is something that I forgot to explain through this slide that is still pretty relevant. The reference of the history that I indicated for the enforcement of constraints in the real-time market has to be taken as a caution and as a reference, but in a relative term, because in the extended day-ahead market, we are, relatively speaking, in a different situation. We are not with this very tight, defined deadline of having to complete everything every 5 minutes, because otherwise you miss the next run of the 5-minute market, right? In the day-ahead market, yes, we have an ideal time window for running the market and publishing results, starting at 10, finishing ideally by 1. There is still some room to be able to let the market run a little bit longer to be able to get an optimal solution. That is already something that happens nowadays. There is more flexibility, what I'm saying, in terms of the time that we have to afford running the market application for the day-ahead market relative to the unmovable fixed window that we have for the 5-minute market. That effectively means that we could afford to have a more complex extended problem in the day-ahead market, because naturally you have a longer window to afford to have this running times to be a bit longer. That on its own is going to make a difference relative to the real time.
So thank you for this explanation. I have one follow-up question on this. I think my concern overall is, are we procuring imbalance reserves that aren't deliverable and paying for those imbalance reserves that aren't deliverable? But listening to your response, Guillermo, it sounds like we can spend more time in the day-ahead market to make sure all these constraints are enforced, so we're not procuring undeliverable imbalance reserves. Is that correct?
Yes, and that is the aim, and that is part of the plan that we have that I'm going to elaborate once we pass this slide.
Thank you.
Okay, can we unmute Steve Keen?
Steve, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead. Steve, you may be double muted on your phone or your headset, whichever you're using.
Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's Steve Keen from Edison. A couple questions about these potential difference in markets and some of the issues that may cause, but different than the ones you were talking about. So the first one is just, as I remember, AS ancillary services are procured not on a nodal basis, but on a regional basis or something like that. How does procuring the energy and the imbalance reserves on a nodal basis, but still doing the AS on this other method, what impacts does that have?
I hear your question. Let me see if I can answer as you expect. You're right. Ancillary services are procured regionally. We have 7, 8 different regions for the different products that we have for AES. The complementary process that we have in place for AES to ensure that they are deliverable is that there is an assessment, typically done by our own operators. Once they realize that there are typical resources stranded on certain transmission constraints that are going to render the AES undeliverable. Those resources effectively are flagged to not be able to carry the AES, and the market is going to procure the AES from other resources. So it is a two-step. One step through the market optimization, complemented with a second step that is a screening by our operators to ensure that they identify AES that is stranded because of transmission constraints. There has been some discussions in the policy space about the nodal deliverability for AES and changes to the AES market. That is beyond the scope of this discussion.
Okay, that provides more information about how things are done, but it's not really addressing my question, which is, what I'm trying to understand is how the procurement of AS may be impacted by the constraints that are affecting where, which resources can provide imbalance energy. And if that creates an opportunity for, well, potentially, I guess, for arbitrage, but also just for strange solutions coming up where there are resources that, are maybe constrained off from providing imbalance reserves, but yet can still provide AS.
Yeah, I'm sure we can hypothesize into these corner dark cases that could potentially happen, right? I would really need you to elaborate more precisely the scenario that you want to discuss, Steve, so that we can answer properly.
Okay, I'll have to think about it some more to see if I can come up with exact examples. The second question is a similar one. One of the configurable parameters is which constraints are going to be enforced on the imbalance reserves. And I believe you said that in these studies, you're assuming that it's the same constraints that are enforced on energy and imbalance reserves. I'm just, wondering, are you going to look at situations where imbalance reserves, where they enforce fewer constraints on the imbalance reserves, and how will that impact the overall optimization and the co-optimization of imbalance reserves and energy?
I hear you, Steve. I cannot appreciate what the question is.
It's just, are you looking? I'm trying to understand what the impacts on the market may be when there are different constraints enforced for energy and imbalance reserves. So assuming imbalance reserves doesn't enforce all the same constraints that the energy market does, that can have, I could see where that could have an impact on the overall market solution. Is that something you're going to be looking at? And I guess one question is, do you have like an idea of what the impacts may be or what you would expect to see? And the second is that something you're going to be looking at, or are we just going to assume that it's not really an issue?
Yeah, let me answer in this way. In any typical quarter, month of the year, we have about 150 constraints congested in the CAISO balancing. I'm sure I can pick a day that is going to give me certain market solution, and I can pick another day that can give me the opposite conclusion. So can I definitely answer and conclude that it's only going to be in one single direction? No, it's going to be highly predicated on the specific scenario of what constraints we are dealing with. I cannot generalize to say that everything is going to move always in one same direction, okay? Just to put the context of the complexity we are dealing with here. That said, yes, we can take a scenario that is going to be subject to the scenario that we pick to see the interplay when we have different set of constraints for imbalance reserves than for energy. Honestly, I don't think we have to even see numbers to realize what implications are, because by principle, you know what is going to happen. And what is going to happen is that you are going to have imbalance reserve assessed against a given set of transmission constraints that can determine how strict your assessment for deliverability is going to be for imbalance reserve. And if that constraint is or is not enforced for imbalance reserve, but is for energy, you know that it's going to be more or less restrictive than the case where you enforce the same constraints for energy and for imbalance reserve. That is just the logical conclusion we can achieve without even having to look at numbers, right? That is the straight implication. The less constraints you enforce for imbalance reserves, the more chances you are taking for procuring imbalance reserves that eventually, when uncertainty happens, they cannot be deployed, they cannot be realized because they are stranded behind transmission constraints. And yes, that is going to have effects on the market because you are going to be pricing certain constraints that otherwise you could have gotten a price signal if you have other constraints enforced. So these are just natural consequences of the transmission constraints enforced. Now, how that is going to impact resources? Well, it depends. Are the resources in the upside of the constraint or in the downside of the constraint? You can have either scenario. So once we are talking about congestion, things are not just black and white that they move in one single direction.
Okay. I'll have to think about that. And what? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
I'm not seeing another.
Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, now let's put all this together and back to the premise of this discussion. As I indicated, within the scope of the working group session for the configurable parameters, we have this item that is the set of enforced constraints that we're going to put for the imbalance reserves. One more time, we are not talking about a parameter, we are not talking about a value to be set, we are talking more about a selection criteria. Under what premise, under what principles we want to enforce certain type of constraints, a set of transmission constraints for imbalance reserves. And in the ideal setup, what we want to do is to ensure that the same transmission constraints we enforce in the day-ahead market are enforced for the real-time market to align the markets accordingly and mitigate for any bias arbitrage that can be generated by that misalignment. In a second step, we also want to have consistency to ensure that we enforce the same transmission constraints that we enforce for energy. Ideally, enforcing all the transmission constraints that we model in the system should be the ideal place to be. But, as I indicated, at the end of the day, the limiting factor is going to be, can we actually afford, computationally speaking, the enforcement of all the expected transmission constraints for imbalance reserves. That is something that we will have to figure out, not in this vacuum discussion, in this market simulation space, because at the end of the day, what drives the computational time of running the market? Well, one is the complexity of the market. The harder the market you have modeled for that specific day, the longer the running time is going to be. But also, the computational capabilities that you have. And as you might imagine, the computational capabilities that we have for the actual production system are superior than the computational capabilities that we have for an offline system like market simulation or parallel operations. So trying to make an assessment of computational times for a setup of a market that is not reflective of what actually 100% production is, and having under par computational capabilities is going to be, to some extent, a futile exercise. We don't find the value to take this exercise at this stage, but most likely it's going to be able to take place once we are in parallel operations, when we have more realistic setup of the system, and we have a system with the computational capabilities closer to what actual production is going to be. Even in parallel operations, if we see potentially challenges in the running times, that may not realize in production, again, because we have the superior computational capabilities in the production system. This is where we are leaning. This is what we are proposing as a plan. Start with all the transmission constraints, and we assess if we can really afford all of them, or we have to scale down to a subset of the transmission constraints. What we have done in the real time is that we have enforced all the physical limitations, including the nomograms. And the piece that has been subject to further assessment is the set of contingencies, because contingencies may or may not realize, and still it's a constraint that is modeled in the market and it creates congestion. Ideally, it should be assessed for deliverability, but it's going to be bounded to how much we can actually enforce in the market. Next slide, please. And I think I have covered this one. I want to put here for mainly a thought process. If we were to reach the condition where, yes, there are computational concerns to be able to run the day-ahead market with all the transmission constraints enforced for imbalance reserve, should there be a second level of assessment rather than going with flow gates plus nomograms and decide whether we can afford contingencies? Maybe there could be some value to at least explore. Can we take a different approach to define the subset of constraints to be enforced, to be based on something that is more regional versus local, or maybe based on the voltage levels, because the voltage level by itself tells you the significance of the transmission constraints. Having 500 kV lines or even 230 kV lines obviously means they are major transmission elements, versus 115 or 69 kV may be more local and less relevant to the conditions of imbalance reserves. And the key point here to create some complication is that naturally, this couldn't be something that can be done dynamically, meaning changing the set of constraints enforced day to day, because the conditions are very dynamic, right? I don't project that we're going to have the ability to dynamically, on a daily basis, adjust what constraints can be enforced for imbalance reserves, and may have to be something more static based on another type of criteria. The nature of the constraint, the type of the constraint, maybe the voltage of the constraint, or something that is more defined to be regional versus local. Hopefully, we don't have to go that far, and the day-ahead market is going to be able to run with all these transmission constraints, but it is a factor that we have to be cognizant that there will be a limitation, a potential limitation here. That's all what I have for this section, and I see one more hand, operator.
Oh, it's Ellen Wolf from Rosero Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Ellen, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks very much for this presentation. It makes me wonder, especially as EDAM expands, does the CAISO have an ability to expand the computational power, you know, especially with advancements in computational methods and such? What opportunities will there be in the future for the CAISO to expand the capabilities and potentially then either speed the market time or enable more constraints to be enforced, for example?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point, Ellen. Thank you for pointing that out. I can tell you that, yes, performance is and has been always a top priority for our technology and infrastructure area. And over the years, we have been continuously making improvements to the performance of the market application, because always the computing, the running time has been a factor to consider. Over the years, just as a testament to that, over the years we have developed many different functionalities, right? And in every round that we have additional functionality, new features, new products, there is always the assessment how we can further improve the modeling, the efficiencies of the market application to ensure that we have the computing power to be able to achieve a solution for that. And over the years, we have added so many different elements to the market. And a good reflection of that is that as of now, we do have the Western energy imbalance market with 23 different balancing areas, with many different products and features and constraints, and also transmission constraints across the entire footprint. And yes, we are able to get a solution for the real-time market to a great extent. So that is always a continuous effort for the CAISO to ensure we are up to speed.
So essentially what I'm hearing is that you add functionality faster than the computational advances allow you to use that to reduce the solution time, for example, that the demands we keep making of you exceed an ability to, you know, to use the advances to reduce the solution time.
Correct. And not only the hardware, but also the software. I can tell you over the years, for instance, we have improved the formulation of the different features in the market, right? And you may recall this, Ellen, it comes back to my mind, but in the past, we used to have a very complicated constraint that created a lot of running time. And we ran through this effort. We published a lot of information in the MPPF somewhere in 2015, 16, when we were really struggling to keep the publication timeline of 1 p.m. And at that time, one of the solutions implemented was to reformulate what we call the minimum online constraint. That is a very taxing, expensive constraint to solve in the market. So it comes hand to hand, improving the formulation, gaining efficiencies in the modeling, together with changes to the hardware.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate the explanation.
Thank you, Ellen. We have one more hand, operator.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison again. I want to follow up on something Ellen said. I think a good question is, you're testing these timing issues right now with EDAM being the KISO and the 2-pack BAAs. Are you also looking at what happens, whether you can solve it fast enough when it expands to include Portland and then, potentially other entities? So, and I realize it's hard to do because there's computational improvements over time, but also, as we add more entities, I'm assuming the complexity of the solution goes up. Do you know how it increases?
I don't have a specific number for that, but I would just make a reference. We don't have to look further than just checking what we are doing for the Western Energy Imbalance Market, right? We are already solving for 23 balancing areas market footprint, and we're able to find solutions in 5-minute basis. So that should give you some sense of the capability that we already have and how that could play for being able to solve the day-ahead market.
Okay, but that's basically solving just a few. There's a limited look ahead there, and in the day ahead, we're looking, over 24 hours, right? And I assume that will continue. So, I'm not versed enough in like the computations to know how much that increases and stuff, but I do know, there was a stakeholder process looking at potentially making the day ahead market solve in 15-minute increments. This was, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something. And, it couldn't be solved fast enough because the computational needs went up exponentially. I'm just wondering if there's a thought on how that would, what happens when you increase the number of these in a market with a lot of different.
One assumption that I
24-day in 24 hours.
One assumption that I read through the comment, Steve, is that there is this belief that the effort increased linearly, and that's not the case. One of the contexts I want to give is that the majority of the contingencies in the footprint are already and will be in the KISO balancing area. There will be additional constraints added as we have additional balancing areas, but the bulk of the constraints are already here, and they are the ones belonging to the California balancing area. That is the reason I always like to point to look at what we are already doing for the real time, right? That is the very reflection that, yes, we are able to handle 23 balancing areas footprint with all the transition constraints. The challenge here is really about the contingencies that will not change significantly by having future EDAM entities because the bulk are already here for the KISO.
Okay, great. Thank you. That helps a lot.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. I will pass it to Jenny and Oswin.
Thanks, Guillermo. Next slide, Isabella. Okay, so for the last 2 meetings, we've been seeing how the benchmark case has been evolving. We started with the October 4th trade date as a reference, and we introduced the benchmark case first in October, and then based on stakeholder feedback, we made some modifications in November, and now we are in December, the 3rd round, and we have some more changes to the benchmark case. So in this presentation, the main focus is congestion, as we're dealing with the set of enforced constraints and also the deployed imbalance reserve factors. So we wanted to tune the benchmark case so that it reflects congestion across the board, congestion for the energy case and congestion for the imbalance reserves as well. So for this set of analysis that Scott will be presenting following this one, we've chosen the high demand and the IR requirement scenario. And For the benchmark, we set the proportion of deployed reserves at 100% and also kept the envelope constraint multiplier at 85%. And in the future slides, you will see a factor that's repeated several times, which is the deployed imbalance reserve factor, or we might call it DIR factors or DIRU and DIRD factors. This is the percentage of imbalance reserve awards that are considered in the congestion for the imbalance reserves. Okay, so with that, we'll go to the next slide. And some of these slides may have been repeated in the last two presentations, but we just wanted to show it out there again for consistency. So to begin with, we have the CAISO benchmark bid stack all the way from our sell schedules, the price floor to the price cap. We have the physical megawatt on the left and virtual megawatts on the left, and we have the demand stack on the bottom right, again, sell schedules and some price sensitive demand. Next slide, please. The next slide is for the PAC DAs, PAC West in the bottom and PAC East in the bottom. Again, supply bids all the way from our bid floor to the bid cap and sell schedules for the demand bids. Okay, next slide. And again, here is our imbalance reserve bid stack. So these are for IRU bids for CAISO, PAC East, and PAC West. No changes here from the last presentation. The same input bid stack is being used for these analysis. Go to the next slide. Similar input bids for IRD. We have IRD bids all the way from $0 up to the $55 bid price cap for both the BAs. Okay. Next one, Isabel. Okay. And here are the benchmark results for all the three BAs. So we have the MEC here, the marginal energy cost, shown for all the BAs. And over the last two presentations, we did explain what was causing the price differences between the two BAs. So if there is price separation in the MEC between multiple BAs, these are mostly, they're coming from the transfers between the BAs. And in the last few presentations, we showed what specific TSRs were binding and causing the price separation between the BAs. And that's also reflected here. So because this is the high demand scenario, the energy MEC is higher than what we saw for the regular benchmark. And okay, you can move to the next slide. Okay. So this is the benchmark result for the three BAs. This is how the supply was cleared. You see that the peak supply cleared is almost around 44,000 for the CAISO BA, and similar higher levels for PAC East and PAC West. So the supply is cleared across wide set of resources that's shown on the legend here: thermal resources, renewables, batteries, and exports, and hydro. Okay, go to the next slide. And over the next 6 slides, we are going to see what are the imbalance reserve prices for each BA. So we start with CAISO, IRU, IRD, and then go to PAC West and PAC East. In all the slides, you'll see the BA level or regional IR price on the top left, and you'll see the breakdown for each BA based on how the IRU is being procured across the whole region. And the bottom, the top right chart shows how the IR is cleared from the resources, which supply mix is used to procure the IR. There is also a black bar there that says demand curve, which means that that portion of IR is being procured from the demand curve, which just means that the demand curve at that segment was more economical than the other supply bids. And also we show the demand curve on the bottom right. so that we'll see at what price levels and at what megawatt quantities the demand curve is being used in the market. So this is for CAISO BA. We see that the price is around $10 to $40, and for PAC BAs is less than $15. Okay. Go to the next slide. Okay. Same thing now for IRD, and how the IRD is cleared for CAISO BA is shown on the right with the demand curve for IRD as well. Okay. Move to the next slide to see the results for PAC West. So this is PAC West for IRU, and then we see the supply mix for PAC West clearing IRU and the demand curve. Right. Go to the next slide. Same thing here. The slides on the left are the same, but the charts that are changing are the ones on the right, the cleared value and the demand curves. Okay. Move to the next slide. Okay. Here we are seeing PAC East now, IRU prices, how it's being cleared from the demand curve and the supply mix. And, go to the next slide. Finally, this is for IRD. Move to the next slide. Okay, and as Guillermo mentioned, so we have new set of transmission constraints being enforced for IR now, similar set that's used for energy. So what we are seeing is what we will start seeing in Oasis. This is a snapshot from map stage Oasis for trade date 12/17. So we've just selected the 32314 constraint, and the column product will show or will determine whether the congestion is for IRU or for energy. If it's not displayed, like the second row in this chart, that's for energy. If it says IRU, this is binding for the IRU case. And you can also have the IRD binding. Okay. And one takeaway is that the resource level IR congestion component is impacted only by the IR deployment scenarios. We will see how this works in the next few slides. But the energy congestion component at the resource level will be impacted both by energy and the IR deployment scenarios. Okay. Go to the next slide. We'll see an example of what was just said in the previous slide. So take a case where Midway Vincent flow gate is binding for a particular hour, hour 15, only for IRU. So that means the energy shadow price is 0. The IRU shadow price is $27.21. So we see that the marginal resource is a resource in PAC West and has a $0 IRU input bid. So here, the PAC West BA level IRU price is $5.52. This particular resource has a shift factor or an effectiveness of 20%, 0.203. Using the shadow price and the shift factor, you can calculate the congestion component of the IRU price, which comes down to be negative 5.52. When you add these two together, the regional level IRU price and the congestion component, you get 0, which is the input bid price of the resource, and that makes the resource marginal for this congestion. Go to the next slide. Okay. So similar analysis here, but this is another hour ending 17, where we have both energy and IRU binding separately, $26 on the first case for energy and $15 for IRU. So the total shadow price now becomes $42. We take a sample resource with an effectiveness about 32%. So we can calculate the energy congestion component and the IR congestion component separately using the shift factor and the shadow prices. So you get around $13.291 for energy and minus 4.86 for IR. And here also, this is something that we mentioned in a few slides back, that the energy congestion component takes the shadow price of both the energy and IRU, whereas the IR congestion component only accounts for the IR deployment scenario shadow price. And a similar analysis of what was presented in the previous slide, we show how the marginal resources prices are being calculated. Same thing that was said in the last slide. We take the shift factors, find the congestion component, take the BA level price, whether it's energy or IR, and then add everything together. Also add other congestion components from other flow gates and calculate the total resource level EN or the IR price, which comes to be the input bit price for the marginal resource. Okay, move to the next slide. Okay, so some math here on what is exactly the constraint that is enforced when we talk about a deployment scenario for IRU or IRD, and also how the deployment factors affect the constraints. And so, for example, in this case, when you set the DFIRU and DFIRD to 0, all those boxes that's highlighted in the red will be 0. So that means no change in IRU and IRD can affect the constraint. But as you'll see what Scott presents in the next set of slides, as we increase the factors from 0 to 1, you will see how the IRU and IRD awards start impacting the congestion and the transmission constraint that's enforced here. Okay. At this point, next slide, Isabella, is this the last one? I'll pause here for questions. What the benchmark is.
Like first in the queue, we have Jordan Miner. Go ahead, Jordan.
Thank you, Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division again. Can we go back to slide 42? I have some questions about it. It's not completely making sense to me.
Sure.
Okay, so on the left hand, we have the regional imbalance reserve up prices. In hour 18, we have a price of $40. But then on the right side, looking at the demand curve and the cleared IOU graphs, an hour ending 18, it's very dark black, so it looks like $55. And then on the top graph for hour ending 18, it looks like the cleared imbalance reserves up for CAISO is being set by the demand curve. So I guess my confusion is, are we clearing at $55 because we're pricing off the demand curve, or we're clearing off $40? That's what the graph on the left is communicating.
Yeah, so the demand curve portion that was being cleared may not be at the $55, because you see on the right, the demand curve goes all the way from $15 to $45. So the portion of demand curve that was cleared for hour ending 18 is a value less than $40. So once the cheaper demand curve is cleared first, you start clearing the other economical resources that are more expensive.
That's actually super helpful to understanding the demand curves. Thank you so much.
And just to add to that, the display that you have on the right-hand side are kind of ranges, right? The bidder stacks are ranges. It's not a gradual sequential display. So the top range is not just $55, maybe a full range up to $55. So it's a discrete range. But the bit that clear, the portion that clear in the demand curve is going to basically match the price that you see in the price illustration on the left.
Got it. And then one follow-up question. So would you be able to provide the averages of the demand curve for each hour? So like looking at 18 again, like how much of that is $55 versus how much of that is like $20, and this average around like $30? I'm just trying to understand how the demand curve works out.
Yeah, we can expand for one particular hour.
Yeah, And just to be sure, we are talking about one single demand curve for the area. That basically means it's one single pair of price quantity. So these are not averages, these are indeed the full value of the demand curve. It's only one demand curve for every hour.
Last presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think one of the presentations in October, we had a sample demand curve for 18.
Yeah, we already showed that. Yeah, actually, Jordan, we can point to you the deck that we covered previously where we actually show the dynamics of the demand curve and how the demand curve actually is constructed, and you can see the linear piecewise of the bit. We can send you the link.
Great, thank you.
And also the demand curves are posted daily in Oasis for all the PAs.
Thank you, Jordan. Next in the queue, we have Callie Wells. Go ahead, Callie.
PTF. I have just a quick question. Can you go to the slides where you were showing where the constraint binds only for IRU deployment and not for energy? And then like the next slide had it binding in both.
Yes, let me search for that slide.
Sorry, I don't know exactly what number it is.
It's a couple more forward.
Yeah, it's the first one with the tabular column. Yeah.
And one more forward. A few more, yeah, get past the
Keep going.
Next one. Next one.
Yeah, oh, perfect,
Yeah.
right here. Okay, so just, can you guys refresh my memory on how local market power mitigation is going to work under this? So in the energy case only, obviously this constraint is not binding, but it does bind in the deployment scenario. So for energy LMPM, is this constraint not going to be tested, and it will only be tested for the purposes of possibly applying mitigation for IR?
Yeah, we will cover this in the next presentation, Callie.
Okay.
When we do more analysis on the MPM side.
Okay, nope, that's great. I will, you mean at the next meeting?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, if you, yeah, just kind of, I think it would be helpful to remind, at least I could use the refresher on under what situations the constraint will be tested for energy mitigation and what conditions the constraints will be tested for IRU mitigation. Thank you.
Thanks, Callie. Next in the queue, we have Carl Dunkel-Werner. Go ahead, Carl.
This is Carl Dunkel-Werner. I'm in the CPUC Public Advocate's Office. I was hoping to ask another question on slide 42, following up on Jordan's. This could just be me not understanding the demand curves, but I've been looking through some of the October materials, and I guess I was hoping to have a little more clarity on what's going on, for instance, between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. and the pricing there. Like, I would have thought each of the bars had some price, some low price and some medium price and some high price, but it jumps. And I was wondering if you could provide some clarity there.
So is it specifically the price spike at 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. going to $40?
No, sorry. I mean the rapid color change. For the bar at 6 a.m. is all in the $50 to $55 range.
I see. So this is a question more of how the demand curve was set in the first place. I mean, yeah, we'll take this back and explain in the next presentation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Alva. Go ahead, Alva.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Just sort of in summary, I mean, I'm actually having a little bit of a difficulty following some of the argument. and I appreciate your making it, but I wonder if there will be, or if you could produce between now and the next meeting. Ideally, it would be the data that's used in the charts in a spreadsheet form. And it obviously doesn't need to be any identification of anything that would reveal information. But I think seeing the numbers in a more detailed way and being able to play with them could be very helpful in trying to understand some of the points you're making here and how general they are, or whether they're just simply particular cases. It's hard for me to understand whether what you're presenting is meant to make an argument in general terms or is just an example. So I'm wondering if it would be possible to publish some spreadsheets containing the source material for these presentations, in particular this one.
Yeah, Alba, I hear you, but let's be realistic that we're in such a crunch time that this would add to our effort to have material in time, right? And we're not talking about one spreadsheet with 20 entries. We are talking about dozens and dozens of records that we have to manually prepare. And that is going to be prohibited to be able to keep the pace of the schedule that is very aggressive that we have in time. If there is a specific illustration that is of great interest, yes, we can ad hoc accommodate that one, but we cannot commit to provide all the raw data across the board because that would be a full-time job.
And I wasn't thinking of the raw data. I was actually just thinking of the numbers that are used in the charts in the slides you're presenting, really not even going beyond that, just to be able to, essentially not eyeball the charts, but to know the numbers in the charts. So I definitely take your point. If I were going to ask for anything, it would be for this series of slides that has just been presented, because I'm, as I said, I'm having difficulty understanding whether what was presented were general points or specific particular examples of what might happen or will happen. And so if it were possible to essentially for this section provide spreadsheets containing the numbers that were the sources for the charts, that would be sufficient. I'm not looking for, certainly not for a set of data to be able to reconstruct the case. I'm just trying to get at what you're actually reporting. Thank you.
Thank you. We will take that into consideration, but I want to be realistic about how much we can do. And
right. And I hear you.
I hear you that whether we are making a statement specific to this case or generic, I think we can do a better job to explain that, well, this is specifically in the context of the solution that we are looking, because we're analyzing specifically a given case. So how far we can extrapolate that to be general conclusions is not about the data that we are showing, it's more about our belief of what we are assessing from that data. So in that sense, I struggle to realize how providing more granular or raw data can make a difference to understand whether we are talking about a specific case or a generic case.
It might not, but I mean, it's more just having a little bit more ability to look in detail at the components of the charts, perhaps.
Thank you. We will consider.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Ellen Wolf. Go ahead, Ellen.
Hi, it's Ellen Wolf from Rosero Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I had a question about the previous slide, the one right before the questions and comments slide. I didn't really follow the discussion, and I almost feel like I should know some background that I don't feel like I know. Can you either explain this again or maybe point me to some place where these factors are described in more detail? Or both?
Sure. These factors will be in the tariff, also the VRS.
There are different pieces, Ellen, of information that we can summarize for you and send that through a link. There is obviously the first level, that is the policy material. We can point to the last version of the proposal where we indicate what the purpose of this is. We also have a second set of documents that refer to the business requirements. That is more on the mechanics of how they are going to be effectuated in the market application. And then we also have more generic descriptions in the filings that we did. So we can point to you to the information. Now,
That's
the
great.
factor that Yeah, the factors that are in discussion today here is effectively a proportion of the contribution that we are going to consider for imbalance reserves when assessing how much of that flows on a transmission constraint. If we are saying a proportion of deployable imbalance reserve is 100%, we are saying for every megawatt that we clear for imbalance reserve, 100% is going to be considered to impact the flow. That is times the shift factor, because still the locational of the resource matter. When we are saying that a 0% deployable factor is going to be considered, we are saying we are not going to consider at all the contributions of imbalance reserves on the power flow contribution. It's that, how much we account for contributing to the power flow of a given transmission constraint coming from imbalance reserves.
Okay, so they're kind of like your expectation of probability of deployment of these resources to impact the constraint. And I guess my question is, at what stage are you in establishing these parameters?
We're in the very first stage. We're trying to socialize with participants how this actually works.
I
so
see.
That we can really pick up on this to the next level that is now going more into what value do we take.
And do you expect to solve this mostly through market sim or through some conceptual discussions?
No, the plan that we have sketched from the beginning of the effort is that this first stage that goes through the month of January is predicated on information of market simulation, and we build up, clean up the cases to really understand the dynamics, the interplays, and the functioning of all these features, and how the setup of these parameters play a role in the market solution. This is more understanding and building the knowledge of how these things work. And based on that, we may have limited information to see if some values are dramatically significant to the market solution. We may propose at the end of January whether we believe that we have to deviate from the starting value that we scheduled to have to the beginning. But the final decision, that is the actual tuning, is going to happen in the second stage, that is going to be within the time frame of parallel operations, February and March. That is where we bring all together and we discuss specifically what values we are recommending for adjusting to be used for the go live. And let me emphasize one more item. We are talking about really about the parameters that are within the scope of BPM changes, because they are in that scope. There are two parameters. There are the bid cap of $55 and the default bid price of $55 that are prescripted in the tariff, and obviously we cannot just change those lightly. Most likely they are going to remain as they are all the way through go live, unless we find something dramatically egregious bad in parallel operations that put us in the track to explore changes. But the most likely path is that we're going to keep those as they are because they are in the tariff, and then we continue to assess in production. So we are really talking about the set of enforced constraints, the multipliers for storage resources, and the deployable factors. That is what we are discussing today.
Okay, thank you so much for indulging me to remind me what these are about. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And I'm seeing one final hand in the queue from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Steve Keen from Edison. Can we go back to, I think it's slide, just a minute. I think it's 48. It's this one. I'm trying to understand first the two bullet points up on top, and then what that means for the information presented below. And I'm having a hard time understanding why the congestion for IR doesn't include the energy congestion. It seems to me that, or perhaps why they're separate. And then looking down below, is it always going to be the case that there will be either one or the other shown? So like in hour ending 4, there's no congestion shown for IRU, but there is congestion shown for energy. I don't understand. I'm having a hard time understanding why that energy congestion doesn't impact the IR.
Yeah, this is just an example, Steve. So you could have both energy and IR winding for the same hour. So that's the answer to the second question.
Okay.
And let me try to give you an illustration just to get some intuition why there could be cases where the imbalance reserves may not lead to congestion on the constraint. So you may have all this type of permutation, right, where you have congestion for energy, and then when you enforce imbalance reserves, you have now congestion for energy plus congestion for imbalance reserves. That could be somehow more intuitive to understand that, yes, you add another element and the constraint continues to be congested. There could be a case, for instance, as you indicated, where it is congested for energy, and once you have imbalance reserves, now it's not congested for energy, but it's congested for imbalance reserves. Let's put the case of a counterflow, that when you assume the uncertainty is realized and you have to deploy the imbalance reserves for energy, depending where the resource that carries the imbalance reserve is located, it could actually provide counterflow. Now you have the energy creating congestion. When you put on top of that the counterflow for imbalance reserves, it basically eliminates the congestion. That would be, in a very simplistic way, a way to get the intuition that it could play either way. It can build up on top of the energy congestion, or it can actually evaporate the congestion because it's providing counterflow.
Okay, but what, all right, I have to think through the implications of that, but that does help some. Now, if you can go to the 1, 2 down, I'm trying to understand here, when you talk about the energy marginal resource and then the IR marginal resource, the calculations on the bottom there, I understand, like, I don't understand where you get the sum of all. You should explain where that sum of all energy LMP congestion components, what that's composed of.
Yeah, so the one above the EN LMP congestion component from this particular flow gate is negative $13, but there are, I think, 62 minus $13 worth of congestion from other flow gates that we've not shown in the chart here. So they are from other flow gates with shadow prices that also have contribute congestion for this resource.
Okay, and then in the one over where it says IR marginal resource, you have a shift factor that is different.
Yeah, if you could go back up to slide 50.
Yeah, I mean the one the shift factor you're showing here is 3.316. That 0.203 is the one you showed on the previous slide, which was for a different hour. Is that, am I missing something, or?
So to begin with, the marginal resources for energy and IR are two different resources. So that's why the shift factor is different.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So the one on the left is a California resource, and then the one on the right is a resource in the Pac West territory.
Okay.
That's the first bullet of each subsection there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right. Thanks, everyone. My name is Scott Lehman. I'm going to be going over the proportion of deployed reserves. So we're going to be looking at the cases that we reran with different values for that factor there. So next slide, please. So the factor we're changing here, which was in that equation on that last slide from the previous section, is the deployed imbalance reserve factor. And just to reiterate once again, that sets the percentage of the imbalance reserve awards that we're going to deploy in the imbalance reserve deployment scenarios. So it determines how much those imbalance reserve awards impact the congestion. We did this with a benchmark case with the 6 DIR factors shown there below, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100. And then we also did a second benchmark case, which was identical to the first, but just with higher IR bids. And so we'll talk about that second. All right, next slide, please. So the first thing that we saw, and here we're looking at congestion shadow prices in each of those DIR factor cases for just one flow gate. So this is a mid-wave instant flow gate. And on the left, we have the energy shadow prices. And then on the top right, we have the IRU shadow prices. And on the bottom right, we have the IRD shadow prices. And they're for each of those 6 cases that we ran. And overall, the impact that we saw was that in the higher DIR factor cases where we're deploying more of the IR awards to the congestion, we see a greater impact on congestion. So that's just what we would expect when we increase the amount of IR that is impacting congestion. We see an increase in overall amount of shadow pricing. And you can see that on the chart in the left. So as we talked about before, both the IRU and the IRD shadow prices also impact the energy shadow price. So we take the sum of the energy and the IRU and the IRD shadow prices in that chart on the left. And then we isolate out the IRU and the IRD on the right on their own, just to show the impact of those kind of individually. So this is what we saw just for this one example, mid-wave instant flow gate. Next slide, please. And here's an example for a J. Hines Aliso nomogram. And we see a similar overall pattern. So again, we have the energy on the left, which includes the IRU and the IRD shadow pricing. And then on the right, we have broken out the IRU and the IRD shadow price. So overall, you can see the IRD shadow pricing looks a lot like the energy shadow pricing. And so the IRD, may have been impacted more by this float or nomogram. Overall, though, the pattern that we are looking at here, where we see increased total shadow pricing with a higher DIR factor, is again kind of roughly what we would expect. It's not always super linear, and in certain hours throughout the case, maybe that pattern is reversed, and that can be due to a bunch of factors in the case. But when we're looking at the overall trends, kind of our expectations held that the higher DIR factors would show increased shadow pricing. Next slide, please. So this chart looks at the distribution of the resource congestion component of LMP for IRU. And we're only looking here at resources that have non-zero IR awards. And so we're just looking at how the congestion is impacting resource awards for IRU. And so what we see on the top left is that when we have a 0 DIR factor, we have no impact to IRU pricing from congestion. So that's a good result. That's what we would expect when we have a DIR factor of 0, which means we are not kind of including the impact of IR on congestion. Then as we kind of ramp up that DIR factor, you'll see that the distribution of the congestion component of LMP kind of grows a little bit. So in the 20% case, we see a little bit of a distribution there, and then it grows up to 100. Maybe not perfectly linear, 80 to 100 doesn't see huge change, but that's what we're looking at here on this chart, trying to tease out how the resource prices are impacted by congestion in each of these different cases. Next slide, please. This chart shows the same thing for IRD. So again, we're looking at the resource congestion component of LMP in each of those reruns with the different DIR factors. And we're looking at the distribution of that resource congestion component of the LMP for IRD. And again, we see very little, or we see 0 impact in the 0 case, and then a smaller impact in the 20% case, with it growing up to the 60, 80, and 100% cases. Not always in a linear way, some hours change. The congestion changed a little bit throughout our reruns, but kind of our overall trend held. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to look at the overall market impact of these DIR factors. So we're going to look at some overall energy and IRU, IRD pricing. So on the left here, we have the CAISO energy pricing in each of those reruns. And on the right, we have the PAC East energy price. And so what you can see is that we don't see huge fluctuations in the energy pricing when we change the DIR factor. There is a bit of a jump there in hour ending 18, and that's actually on the 60% DIR factor case. After some investigation, this was due to some imperfect optimization, or what we might call a corner solution in the market. But overall, even on this kind of high load day that we have here, the impact on overall energy pricing for CAISO was moderate and PAC East was even less. Next slide, please. So these charts are looking at the IR pricing. So we have the IRU pricing on the left and the IRD pricing on the right. And so again, we see pretty small changes, but a little bit more going on here with the IRU and IRD pricing. So in certain hours, we actually saw lower IR pricing with the higher IR factors, which is kind of the inverse of what we'd expect. And then in other hours, we saw more of what we would expect. But as with energy, kind of the overall impact to the IRU price was fairly limited. Again, we're talking here about the overall CAISO IRU price. So local areas might have seen slightly more impact, and that's what we tried to look at with those distribution charts. And again, yeah, that 60% case is that jump there in hour ending 18 for IRU, which was due to that imperfect optimization corner solution. If we look at the IRD chart on the right, it follows a bit more of the pattern that we would expect, especially in those later hours, so hours ending 18 to the end of the day, where we see that higher DIR factor results in a higher overall CAISO IRD price. That 60 case is again a bit of an outlier there, but that shows kind of the impact on pricing that we saw from the DIR factors. So we're going from a price of around $16 in that 100% case down to a price of maybe $14, $13 in that 0% case. So not huge impacts on the overall IRD pricing. Next slide, please. So given that we saw these kind of pretty modest impacts of the DIR factors on the original benchmark, we decided it would make sense to run a second set of scenarios with some higher IR bids to see if that would cause more of an impact. So what we did is we took the same benchmark we had for that original set of scenarios and we increased the IR bids. We raised the floor of the IR bids to 2750 and reran with the same set of DIR factors. We saw still pretty limited impact, and we'll go through that impact in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at our original benchmark on the left versus our high IR bids benchmark on the right. And you can see the overall impact on the energy price was still pretty modest. We see maybe slightly increased variation between some of the runs. So maybe some slightly higher impact. Also that 60% case is no longer an outlier there, and our ending 18. But again, pretty similar patterns, just with slightly increased variation between the DIR factor reruns. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at the CAISO IRU pricing between the original benchmark and the high IR bids benchmark. You can see on the right that we increase the overall CAISO IRU pricing when we have higher IR bids. That's just what we would expect. And we do see some increased variation in the CAISO IRU price in that higher IR bid scenario. You know, in that hour ending 9, we see some maybe new congestion popping up there that's creating some spreads, but they're not always in the pattern that we would expect. So some of our higher DIR factor cases see that higher IRU price, and then some of the lower DIR factors show a lower IRU price. So we're not always seeing the exact correlation there that you might expect. Next slide, please. So this is the IRD pricing between the original benchmark and the high IR bids case. You can see that the IRD pricing increases in that high IR bids case again, just like we would expect. And the overall pattern is pretty similar, but we actually see a little bit less variation here between the cases from the original benchmark and the high IR bids case. Next slide, please. So one thing that really changed between our two cases is the amount of demand curve procurement. So when we increase the IR bids, we see therefore significantly more use of the demand curve because the demand curve stayed the same, and so the demand curve becomes a cheaper alternative in many of these cases, and that can impact the congestion as well. So that was one thing we wanted to highlight here, that between the original benchmark and the high IR bids case, we see large changes in that demand curve procurement. Next slide, please. This chart shows, again, that distribution of the resource congestion component of LMP for IRU in the high IR bids case. Because of that higher demand curve procurement, we see significantly fewer resources with non-zero IR awards because more of it is being eaten up by the demand curve. So these charts, that's one reason these charts have slightly fewer data points. We still see a little bit of the pattern where we have more larger spreads in the congestion component of LMP for this IRU when we increase the DIR factor, but it is a little bit more muted. Next slide, please. And here we see the same thing for the IRD product, where we're looking again at the IRD resource congestion component of LMP spreads. And again, we see bigger impacts to these individual resources in those higher DIR factor cases. I think it's a little bit clearer here actually for IRD. Next slide, please. Actually, that's the end of my section, so can end there and I'll take whatever questions are in the queue.
We have a couple questions in the queue. First, we have a hand raised from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
I'm sorry, this is Steve. I just forgot to put it down last time.
Thanks, Steve. Next in the queue, we have Alva. Go ahead, Alva.
Thank you for your presentation. This is Alva from PG&E. So the deployment, this is a really interesting series of slides you presented on the deployment factors. Prior to considering the demand curve, would you agree that as the deployment factor increases, basically what you're going to potentially increase the amount of congestion that is going to be attributed to the imbalanced reserves, but also you're going to tend to move towards solutions that are going to try to avoid congestion, right? So there's a double effect that's going to be happening from having a higher deployment factor. And so the results in terms of the solution, in terms of where you actually procure the imbalanced reserves, could change drastically because of the fact that in one case, you're not making any assumptions about whether it's deployable, essentially, and in the other, you're requiring that every megawatt of imbalanced reserve be fully deployable. Is that correct, do you think?
I think you're thinking about that right. Yeah, in the first case,
Okay.
we're not considering
So
deployability on our transmission system, and then in the last
Right,
case,
right.
100%.
Yeah, so that's
we want
basically the
all
meaning of
deployable.
a zero deployment factor, is that you're essentially not worrying about any deliverability outside of the base case for these imbalanced reserves. So you're pretending that there's no effects on the other than those that are in the base case on on congestion from needing to deploy these reserves. One thing I was curious about is so on the other side of this is that when you have a very high deployment factor, you're basically making a strong assumption about how you're going to need to deploy the imbalance reserves. And I was wondering if maybe you're also showing that there's not a need to necessarily go to 100%, or maybe that even 100% might even be counterproductive, because it essentially assumes that all of the uncertainty is perfectly correlated, and that at every point in the system, you're going to be procuring, essentially, you're going to be needing imbalance reserves in exactly the ratio of that those deployment factors are indicating, whereas uncertainty is likely to not be perfectly correlated in that way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to know where the uncertainty is going to materialize, but we, through the process that kind of assigns the shift factors for the requirements and for so when we have the deployment scenarios and we're deploying IRD in the congestion scenario, we do assign out that additional requirement as load using a set of shift factors.
Right.
So we are kind of looking at the areas in the system where we would expect the uncertainty to occur. But
you think
I would agree that.
You think you're looking at where the uncertainty would occur, or you think you're looking at where the most effect on congestion would occur? Because I'm not convinced of the former. I mean, the shift factors are just a artifact of the transmission model, right?
Right. Yep.
So,
and
you're
more about the requirement under the deployment scenario.
Right. So you're arguing that the requirement, it's more appropriate to have a higher requirement where there's essentially more sensitivity to congestion.
Right, and in that way, we should be capturing under these congestion scenarios, the most likely places where we might have congestion, and then so I'm just basically saying that these congestion scenarios are not just randomly spread across the nodes in the system.
I wouldn't say randomly. I'd say that it's based on it's like I said, it's based on that the uncertainty in the load is going to be distributed with perfect correlation across the system. So there's not going to be any. I'm just wondering whether that's too restrictive of an assumption. Maybe that's a reason to not deploy at 100%, because that way you account for the fact that in general uncertainty is going to be in any particular case, in any particular interval, it's not going to be all across the system peanut buttered. It's going to be within particular locations. That doesn't have anything to do with congestion. It just has to do with where load happens to turn up, or where resources, resource uncertainty happens to turn up. It has nothing to do with the congestion model per se.
Yeah.
We follow the logic, Alban. That's actually a very good point. You are right that what we're using for the deployment scenarios is the bookends, right? We have the assumption that we are realizing all the uncertainty at the same time. Yes. And we know that may not be necessarily what happens every single time, right? I think there has been a lot of debate in the early stages of what could be a better deployment scenario. And I have to say we may be overdue to do some assessment of realistically how the uncertainty realizes throughout the system, locationally speaking. And to your point, if we have that uncertainty on the deployment of uncertainty, then the proportion factor may play a role to even things out, because yes, there is some consideration that not all of that may realize all the time.
Right. Yeah. I think some of your numbers, Scott, may show that a lower, and I'm not saying go to zero, because I think zero is obviously has no test at all. But I think a lower factor than 100% might be more appropriate based on that consideration. Thank you very much. It's an excellent presentation, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Alva. Yeah, I definitely agree that we don't know when the uncertainty will materialize, not 100% of the time, obviously. So yeah, we'll give that some more thought. Thanks.
And I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue at this time.
This is Jenny Arash. I'm going to go through one final example that will pull these two concepts, the congestion and the deployment factor, together again in another way. So we did look at the two extreme cases of a 0% deployment for imbalanced reserves, which is on the left, and then the 100%, the full deployment of reserves on the right. And so we can look at the tallest bar in each graph, that's hourly 18. And so we do see that impact, that when we do go to the full deployment, 100%, we procure 256 megawatts less of IRU due to the higher cost of getting that congested imbalanced reserves. And so let's go deeper into that. Next slide. So we're bringing back the Midway Vincent congestion, which does split California into Northern California and Southern California. And the way this is binding, it has a north to south flow, meaning we would like to increment resources in the south and decrement resources in the north. So my first example is the resource in the north. So it will see a negative congestion component because it's not desired. And if it has output, it'll exacerbate congestion on Midway. But if we procure imbalance reserve down, that actually alleviates congestion. So we can see the difference between the 0 deployment and the 100 deployment scenario here in the chart. When we get to the 100% case and we're realizing the full congestion of this resource, we do increase its energy, which does exacerbate that congestion, but that's countered by the IRD dispatch, the down dispatch. So we go from procuring about 220 of IRU in the 0 deployment to once we get to the 100% deployment, now we're procuring 220 of IRD, actually. So it's a pretty big shift in this actual Northern California resource in this example, or actually in the actual scenario in ironing 18. Next slide. And then let's look at the southern resource. So again, I said, southern resources are preferred. They will have a positive congestion component that raises their LMP that shows that that's where we want the energy. So their output would alleviate congestion on Midway, but if we procured IRD from them, then they would exacerbate congestion. So the southern resource, when you go from the 0 deployment scenario to the 100% case, instead of having, in the 100% case, you're going to go to the IRU dispatch, which alleviates congestion, instead of the previous IRD dispatch that you had, which would have exacerbated Midway congestion. So next slide, just to summarize this. We have the resources on complete different ends of this this flow gate, and when we do the 100% full deployment of imbalanced reserves, resources that have IRD that would alleviate congestion are selected for IRD, and resources that where IRD would exacerbate the congestion is not selected. Same with IRU, the resource that exacerbates congestion with IRU is not selected in the 100% case. I think that takes us to the end of our presentation, so we'll take another round of questions here.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I'm not seeing any hands in the queue or anything in the chat. So if there's no questions, I think we can move to our next steps. All right. Well, in terms of our upcoming meetings, our next working group session will be on January 29th. So we'll send a notice in the daily briefing a couple weeks prior confirming that date. And then we'll have 2 more working groups after that. So our February one will be on the 26th, and then one more following that on March 26th. Next slide. In terms of comments on this working group, the comment period will be open between today and January 8th. We added some dates in there to accommodate for the holidays. So those will be due January 8th of 2026, and we'll work to get the comment template available out on that page tomorrow. So if you have any questions, please send us an email at isostakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And with that, I'll hand things over to Christina.
Thanks, Isabella. We'll go ahead and wrap up today's workshop. I just have a couple announcements to share before we conclude. Here's some meetings and comment deadlines and trainings that occurred this week at the ISO. And here are some details on market simulation meetings and business practice manual updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see our latest blog posts. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and all meeting materials are available on the initiative webpage, and the video recording will be posted there soon as well. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.